Boker Tov, everybody. Rabbi Leah here with Hi There with Rabbi Leah. I hope you're doing well. It seems to be a beautiful morning. We've had some pretty warm and steamy weather the last few days, but I guess that beats the alternative, right? So it's beautiful out. I feel like singing this morning a little bit. I hope you might join me. Um, Moda ani lefanecha melech chai v'kayam, or Moda for those of you who are female. And you can either sing with me or you can listen to me sing. I won't know either way because I'm coming to you virtually. But why don't you sing a little bit? It'll get that blood flowing and get that oxygen going to your brain and so on. Here we go. Moda ani lefanecha melech chai v'kayam שהחזרת בי נשמתי בחמלה, בחמלה, רבה אמונתך, רבה אמונתך. Let's try it again. מודה אני לפניך. מלך חי וקיים, שהחזרת בי נשמתי בחמלה, בחמלה, רבה אמונתך, רבה אמונתך. Nothing like starting the day with a little bit of a song, even though you may have been up for a while. I'm just finishing my smoothie this morning. Blueberries, raspberries, strawberries, bananas, protein powder, chocolate protein powder, a little bit of peanut butter, and some almond milk, and a tiny dash of some berry boost juice. And that's it. And boy, oh boy, is that delicious and filling and healthy. So I'm feeling raring to go this morning. And I'm trying to get my strength up and get my energy up and get myself prepared because Rosh Hashanah is 7 weeks away. I can't believe it. I just cannot believe it. It is not early this year, and it's not late this year. It's right on time. And I always love when people say it's early or it's late because there is no such thing. It is on time according to the Hebrew calendar. Before we get to Rosh Hashanah, however, there's something that comes before that, and that's what I want to talk about today. And since we have 7 weeks between now and Rosh Hashanah, I thought that I would use these weeks and this time in Chai There with Rabbi Leah to talk about some interesting pieces of the High Holy Days that you may or may not be familiar with, but it never hurts to repeat, right? I think that one of my goals this year, because we are going to be worshiping virtually, is to do whatever I can to make this set of holy days as meaningful for you as possible. Now, as your rabbi, I can't do it all for you. I can kind of create the environment in which it can happen. I can have music that will be meaningful for you and so on. But you have to be an active participant. You can't come as a spectator because worship is not a spectator sport. It is a participatory sport or activity or endeavor. So if you're going to be watching the services, it would be wonderful if you would participate as well. instead of just watching. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be teaching over the next 7 weeks a few things that I think might help you to um, be more engaged in services when they do come around, especially since we're not going to be in the synagogue. We're not going to be in front of the ark. I will be, but you won't be. And it's going to be a little more challenging to create that kind of a worship environment without all the accoutrements of the synagogue. So the first thing I want to mention is something that I talked about this past Saturday when I spoke about the special Shabbatot that fall during the year. And I mentioned to you that this past Shabbat marked the first Sabbath after Tisha B'Av, which is this great day of fasting and mourning. And Tisha B'Av marks the beginning of what's known as the 7 weeks of consolation. So every Haftarah that comes, starting with the Saturday after Tisha B'Av and up until Rosh Hashanah, is a particular kind of a Haftarah that has a message of comfort and healing, because we are trying to move out of that feeling of despair and desolation that we had from Tisha B'Av, from remembering the destruction of the temples in Jerusalem, remembering so many calamities that befell the Jews over so many millennia, and now moving into a more reflective phase, but not necessarily a negatively reflective phase. One in which we are eventually going to celebrate the birthday of the world. The world's going to be 5,781 years old, and she doesn't look a day over 5,779. Just kidding. Anyway, so what happens leading us up to this time is critical. The month of Elul, the month that is the entire month preceding Rosh Hashanah, is a month that is dedicated to reflection, introspection, reading, writing, doing those things which enable you to begin to reflect on who you are, who you've been over the past year, areas of your life that have worked for you, things that maybe haven't worked for you, relationships that have been wonderful and those that are in need of healing, and to begin to take what we call a cheshbon hanefesh. A cheshbon is an accounting, and your nefesh is your soul. So much of the work of the High Holy Days takes place long before we even enter the synagogue for the first service. And part of that begins, and I'll be sharing with you some of these exercises and processes that you can do on your own over the next several weeks, even before we enter Elul, in order to get yourself prepared for this marathon that we are about to run. Before Erev Rosh Hashanah, there is another observance that we participate in called Slichot. And I'm sure you're familiar with the word Slichot. This falls generally the Saturday night before Rosh Hashanah, as long as it is at least 4 days before. This year, it happens to be almost a full week because Rosh Hashanah starts on a Friday night and then is Saturday. And so we do Slichot the Saturday before Erev Rosh Hashanah. There have to be at least 4 days in between Slichot and Rosh Hashanah, and I'll explain why in a little bit, but you may be able to guess. You know, we don't really want to go from Slichot right into Rosh Hashanah, right? But there are reasons for this. So Slichot is both a noun. It's a noun, and slichot is the plural of the noun. The singular is slicha. And actually, the word slicha means excuse me, forgive me. If you're walking down a street in Jerusalem and you accidentally bump into somebody, you would say slicha, which means I'm sorry. So slichot is a category of penitential prayers that's based upon biblical poetry. And some believe that they may have been a continuation of the Psalms. So some scholars think that these slichot were, because they're based upon biblical poetry. In other words, there's a verse drawn from here and a verse drawn from there. And of course, if you are a biblical scholar, and I'm certainly not, but if you knew the Bible, the entire Bible, backwards, forwards, I'm having a little input from one of the dogs this morning. Tootsie is by no means a biblical scholar, but if you are somebody who knows biblical poetry, you would see the similarities between these penitential prayers and the format of the Psalms. And through these prayers, through these slichot, the worshiper repents, asks for pardon, and pleads for mercy. And the premise is that calamities in the world are the result of Israel's sin and not God, because God is just. Let me say that again. The premise is that calamities in the world are the result of Israel's sin, or if you want to be more universal, humanity's sin, and not God, because God is just. We could spend a lifetime discussing that alone, but we're not going to here. Confession and praying for forgiveness can avert sin. So as we hear in our liturgy, teshuvah, right? Tzedakah. So there are some things that can help to avert sin or to minimize the punishment. More on that later. Some of these piyutim are quite old. Some of these penitential prayers, these slichot. And we think some could be as old as the 1st century of the Common Era, and they were written through the 15th century. So there's a huge array of this slichot literature and liturgy, and some of it is quite old and some more contemporary, if you consider the 15th century to be contemporary, which, based on how long Jewish history is, the 15th century could be considered contemporary. Ashkenazi custom is to begin slichot on the Saturday midnight, at least 4 days before Rosh Hashanah, or a week earlier if Rosh Hashanah begins on a Monday or Tuesday. So this year, Rosh Hashanah begins on a Friday night. So the prior Saturday, this year happens to be, I believe, the 12th of September, Slichot would begin at midnight that night. Now, we won't be doing our Slichot service at midnight. I think that everybody's going to be sleeping by then, probably myself included. So we will have the service at a reasonable time, but after, hopefully after the sun has set, so that we get a sense of the darkness. Usually the service is done in the pitch dark with candles lit. It's got a very mystical, kind of a magical feel to it. So as I mentioned, there must be at least 4 days between Slichot and the beginning of Rosh Hashanah. And that 4 day time period is based upon a very ancient ritual, which was the sacrificial offering that took place in the temple. And that offering was scrutinized and examined for 4 days prior to Rosh Hashanah, between Slichot and the beginning of Rosh Hashanah, to make sure that there was no blemish that would disqualify the offering, because of course these offerings had to be absolutely pure, without any blemish, and so on. So not only was the sacrificial offering observed for 4 days to make sure that it was without blemish, so too human beings need at least a minimum, at a very minimum, 4 days to examine themselves, their own behavior, prior to entering into the days of awe. So this is the final warm-up before the marathon that we have an opportunity to take part in, that helps us to get really into the frame of mind and prepared. The custom of beginning the slichot, these penitential prayers, at midnight is actually based upon a verse in a psalm. And that is Psalm 119, verse 62. As an aside, you might be interested to know that Psalm 119 is actually the longest chapter in the entire Hebrew Bible. And it is an acrostic, which means that each line of the psalm begins with a different letter of the Hebrew alphabet. First Aleph, then Bet, then Gimel, and so on. And each letter of the Hebrew alphabet is repeated, I believe, 7 times. So that's what makes it a very long chapter. It goes on for a very long time. And I always say that I'm really glad that it's not part of Hallel. Hallel goes through Psalm 118, because if we had to do Psalm 119 for Hallel as well, we'd be in shul all day. And here is the verse. It says, Chatzot Laila Akum lehodot lach al mishpatei tzidkecha. This is very tiny Hebrew that I'm reading here. Let me look at it again. Make sure I read that correctly. Chatzot laila akum lehodot lach al mishpatei tzidkecha. Yes, I arise at midnight to praise you for your just rules. So indeed, we believe that that is why Slichot began at midnight. Now, in a lot of congregations, under normal circumstances, when we're not having a pandemic, many congregations will have a Slichot service, some at midnight, some maybe earlier than that, but generally they will have some kind of a teaching or learning session. Perhaps they'll bring in 2 or 3 scholars, or the rabbis and cantors will do some teaching. And then they will follow that with a service, so that it is done at night, after sundown, definitely, and certainly after Havdalah, because Saturday night you have to do Havdalah before you can do anything else. The supplications that we also do in our regular traditional prayers on Mondays and Thursdays, which are Torah reading days in addition to Saturday. But on Monday and Thursday, there are certain prayers that are called Tachanun, which are also part of the Slicha liturgy. So we see Tachanun done on Monday and Wednesday. It's very interesting. These are these prayers of supplication, penitential type prayers. And in fact, it is traditional that when one says these prayers, and I'm going to get to what they are in a minute, and you're going to recognize them, that there is we have a lot of choreography in our Jewish worship services, right? Bowing and leaning and bending and going up on toes and so on. So the posture for Tachanun is one of supplication, in which generally the head goes down like this on the arm or on the bench in front of you or something like that. So much of what we say on Slichot is also said during the rest of the week at worship services, but for those of us who don't worship 3 times a day, you may not recognize them. As I said, often there's a study session prior. The mood of the evening is supposed to remain solemn. I know there are a lot of congregations that used to do, like wine and cheese and dessert type programs and speakers, but it's really not a time for celebration. It's a time for learning and a time for prayer. The order in which the slichot, in which these penitential prayers are said, was initially found in the 9th century Seder Rav Amram. Now, why am I calling it a Seder instead of a Sidur? Well, it wasn't until the 9th century of the Common Era that the order, the Seder of the prayer book was set down. And that came as a result of a she'ela, a question that was sent to Rav Amram by a community somewhere, probably in Babylonia, saying, we need some guidance here. What's the order of the service? And by the way, that order from the 9th century is what we still basically use today for the order of our service. So that we know that Baruch Hu comes before the Amidah, and we don't get to Aleinu until we've done Shema, right? So the order of the service has been the order of the service for centuries. There are a variety of customs with respect to when in the service we recite piyutim, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about piyutim. Sometimes it's before the Amidah, sometimes after a certain blessing, sometimes after the Amidah. So there can be some variety in terms of the placement of some of these different penitential poems, but they're all there. They may be in a little bit different order. When I'm speaking of the order of Rav Amram, of Rabbi Amram, I'm speaking of the actual liturgical pieces of the service, not these additional penitential prayers. So what's included in here? What do we have? Well, we have Ashrei. Ashrei, a prayer, how happy, Ashrei Yoshvei Techa, how happy is a person to dwell in your house. Psalm 145. We have Chatzi Kaddish. We have a Kaddish Shalem, which is a complete Kaddish. We have biblical quotations. We have a strong emphasis on the 13 attributes of God. We have an Ashamnu, which is which is one of part of the prayers of repentance, Ashamnu, which is an alphabetical acrostic listing of all of our sins. And then we have these piyutim. And these piyutim are some beautiful penitential type poems that were written by very famous poets such as Yosei ben Yosei, Moses ibn Ezra, and Rashi. And many of them are alphabetical acrostics, and some even reverse alphabetical acrostics. And some of them, not only are they alphabetical acrostics, but they also include the author's name or an acrostic of the author's name. So, for example, if the author's first name was Yitzchak, he may have written the poem with a yud in the first line, and the first word would start with a yud, like Adonai or Yisrael. And then the second line would start with a tzadi. He might use the word tzedek. And then the third line with a chet. And he might start the line with chesed or something like that. And we actually have an acrostic like this in our Siddur that we use on Saturday morning. I believe I pointed it out to you before, but I will again this coming Saturday so that this will make more sense to you. But it was their way of showing who it was that wrote the poem, and it is also their accolade to themselves, I guess. Instead of signing a manuscript or a piece of artwork, you put your name in the poem. Some of this poetry, as I mentioned, is quite old. It was developed in Byzantine Palestine around the same time as the poetry in the Byzantine Church. And so the Byzantine Church and in the synagogue. So it really isn't known which came first, Byzantine piyutim or Hebrew piyutim. But in that part of the world at that time, there was a tremendous amount of mixing of cultures, ethnicities, borrowing. The word we use the word syncretism to talk about borrowing from one culture and another. And we talked about this before in terms of our study on Pirkei Avot, where we actually came across some of the rabbis who had very obviously Greek names. So we know there was a lot of borrowing and sharing of cultures dating back to the beginning of the Israelite cult. We know through pottery shards and so on that were found where travelers came to the ancient land of Israel across the sea, and shared their culture and their arts with us, and we shared with them. After all, why would the Torah be so full of admonitions on the part of God saying, don't you mix with those other people? It won't go well for you, if the Israelites weren't mixing it up with the other people. So I'm going to let it go there. And when we meet again next Tuesday, because Hi There with Rabbi Leah is only going to be Tuesday mornings from now until the high holidays, just once a week. I think that is going to be enough. And we'll continue with the piyutim. I want to give you some examples of how beautiful some of these are. You're going to recognize them, but you're going to learn a little bit more about them. And when we're done talking about slichot, I'm going to do a couple of sessions on Rosh Hashanah and some things to think about during the month of Elul, which starts in a couple weeks. And then for a couple weeks prior to Rosh Hashanah, I'm going to talk about Yom Kippur, and my hope is that you'll all be raring to go by the time we sit down to services together. Lehitraot. I'll see you later. Bye bye.